So we're back with some more Great Dark Beyond cards to review. Today we got Mage stuff, including a kind of spicy new spin on Elemental Mage. And I know I'm woefully late on this one. My toddler chose violence last night. She did not sleep at all. Has been very fussy today, so I'm just behind on everything. But we're catching up with Exarch Hataru here. New 5-cost Draenei legendary. He's a 5/5 with Battlecry. Discover a spell and reduce its cost by 1. If you play it this turn, repeat this effect. And I will remind you too that we did see some previous Draenei and Mage in the first review, the Ingenious Artificer in particular. This one, the next Draenei you play refreshes mana crystals equal to its attack. Notably, Exarch has 5 attack and costs 5. That means if you play these 1/2, then you go into your Exarch turn here with basically full mana. It doesn't cost anything for the Exarch, so you're right back where you started. We also have the Archwing Pilot, which, theoretically, if you build a handful of really cheap spells, you could maybe save those up for the Archwing Pilot. So this kind of little mini Draenei cycle here. Now, Hataru himself is kind of like an Instructor Fireheart back in the day for Shaman. Now, the great news about that was, it was 3 mana to start. This is, either 5 or potentially 0 if you combo it with the Artificer. Certainly you want it to be 0. I think it's going to be really hard to kick off a turn at 5 here and make this worth it. So for this one, there's no limiter on either end. You can get really big expensive stuff, or you can get like 1-cost spells and push them to 0, which means you could just keep chaining off like Seabreeze Chalice over and over and over again, I guess, until like hand size at least became a problem. But which sounds kind of scary, right? Like there will be those moments where this just high rolls into a bunch of super cheap stuff, and you play this on even like turn 6 or 7, it costs 0, and you just create this absolutely monster chain of super cheap spells. So the question for me then becomes kind of with this card, can a deck handle that brick? Like, is that deck gonna be okay if Hataru doesn't go nuts? Or does he steal games with such regularity when he does go nuts? Like, does that just completely blow people out? Does that win you a game because you got like some spell damage and Seabreeze Chalices and a bunch of cheap spells, whatever it is? Can you piece together a win out of the Hataru to make it worth it? And I'm actually pretty torn on that. I think some decks will just need to be too consistent, too efficient to go down this little side road of a Hataru Discover turn that like tries to bail them out with some kind of crazy manufactured win condition of sorts. Whereas other decks that are maybe a little bit slower, stuff in that kind of Reno vein or some kind of grindier Mage deck, might have space to play a Hataru. If it hits a Blizzard or Flame Strike or something, they're like, oh, okay, whatever, I'm kind of a slow deck, I'll just take that and move on with my life. I got some extra removal, I'm not mad. But then occasionally you chain together 4 or 5 crazy cheap spells, piece together some absurd recovery turn or stabilization or board flip or whatever, or just lethal out of that, and it's worth it to kind of run this as a flyer in that kind of deck. So I do think the pop-off potential here is high enough, but I will say it does take a commitment of at least a couple Draenei. I don't know if Archwing Pilot also goes in there, but you could kind of try to put all this together over multiple turns where the Hataru is not going off all at once, but kind of stocking up some discounted spells. And then you've got an Archwing Pilot, but I think that kind of, encourages another Artificer to kind of get that discounted. So there's a lot of little moving pieces there, but I think it's solid enough. Running a 6-card little Draenei diversion in your deck is not a huge crazy ask for a result like this that can go kind of nuts. Just don't expect this to be a consistent win condition sort of card, or even a consistent like value inclusion like Instructor Fireheart was for so long. I think this demands a little bit more commitment, and that means not every deck can just kind of toss this in. All right, so moving on to the next legendary. This is Seron, who is so sick looking, dude. I love this card art so much. This whole like aesthetic is cool. He's a 6-mana 7/6 elemental. Battlecry, give all elementals in your deck fire spell damage +1. And this is really setting up a kind of fire spell elemental hybrid package. We've also got Blasteroid. Shuffle 5 random fire spells into your deck. They cost 2 less, which that is an enormous discount. Blazing Accretion. Destroy the top 3 cards of your deck. Any fire spells or elementals drawn, or excuse me, any fire spells or elementals are drawn instead of being destroyed. Solar Flare, deal 2 damage to all enemies, costs 1 less for each elemental you control. Potentially very cheap. Supernova, this one probably doesn't really go in this package, but it does generate a bunch of fire spells that cost 1 less. And then Spontaneous Combustion, deal 4 damage to a random enemy. If you played an elemental last turn, choose the target, which does, of course, mean this can reliably hit face in an elemental deck. And that's a handful of fire spells for stuff like Blasteroid to generate, or for you to hard run in your deck as, you know, synergies and payoffs. And notably, if we look at the fire spell package in Mage right now in Standard, there are quite a few fire spells. We've got 12 fire spells. A number of them are pretty cheap, especially after you look at like the discounts from Blasteroid. You're talking about like 0 and 1 mana stuff. There are some bigger ones that might be a bit clunkier, but importantly, most of them go face or have ways to go face. Even some of the big ones like Firelands Portal, Sunset Volley can go face, and then a lot of these are just like straight up face damage cards. Molten Rune, Fireball, Spontaneous Combustion can go face, Heatwave can go face, Flame Geyser of course can go face, Explosive Runes technically a little bit of face damage, which is potentially very deadly, especially in combination with spell damage. Now, the extra elephant in the room, which you're probably waiting on me to talk about, is this guy, the Overflow Surger. If you give this fire spell damage +1 and it copies itself a bunch, then all of those copies are going to have fire spell damage +1, which is obviously incredibly lethal. 7 of these on board with spell damage means +7 spell damage for your fire spells, which means this deals 11 suddenly for the Spontaneous Combustion. This deals 9 to the entire board and face, right? And that's where Seron becomes this really scary like finisher card of sorts, where you maybe just play this down, you Blasteroid at whatever point, you start accruing these really cheap fire spells. Sometimes you're probably just going to have lethal off of little, you know, fire elemental boards, because every elemental is getting fire spell damage. So a little Blasteroid, a little Accretion, a little Firefly or whatever. And then you get a hand of, you know, a couple cheap fireballs that are like +3 spell damage. You're probably just going to find some windows where you have some lethals. But then, of course, if you need like a really crazy push, you could set up for that Overflow Surger combo of sorts, get like 7 fire spell damage, and then really wait to blow people up all at once, because that's a pretty cheap upfront cost for 7 spell damage at only 4 mana for the Surger. And then, you know, 4 or 5 fire spells in hand, just like blow up anybody. So then the question becomes like, can you get to that point reliably and safely? Because Seron is a big 6 cost card, which, you know, that's not happening in the early game. It's taken a while to get to the point where this spell damage is like incrementally improving all of these spells or creating those lethal opportunities. Now, the good news is like you might play this on 6 and honestly have, you know, a lethal setup pretty soon thereafter. It's not usually going to be off Surger, because you'd have to like top deck the Overflow Surger pretty dang quickly in order to make that work. But, you know, play this, play a Blazing Accretion on 7, you draw a couple elementals, that's 2 fire spell damage as long as they're cheap, right? And you can probably already start piecing some stuff together with the hopefully, you know, faster tempo start that an elemental deck provides. That said, stuff like Blasteroid and Blazing Accretion, if you're playing them earlier in the game, they're not exactly the most threatening tempo minions. And I will note that like Elemental Mage did find a lot of success in a recent meta, but that was largely in part thanks to Lamplighter. But I sort of think the Lamplighter game plan was, you know, just happening faster and more reliably, and was supported by an early game package that was, you know, kind of more aggressive and was really pushing little chip damage throughout the course of the game. This sort of shifts things more in this almost combo-y direction, where you're maybe less concerned about chip damage and more concerned about like setting up for later. I don't know if that's going to be better in modern Hearthstone. I have some concerns that this just comes down too late. Especially if you're trying to rely on the Overflow Surger package, like you might already draw those before you play your Seron, because keep a note, this is not hitting hand, it's only hitting deck. Of course, in hand would be nuts. So you might miss your window there. It might be hard to kind of save up elementals when you still need things to play. You've also got this risk if you're shuffling a bunch of fire spells into your deck, you might break your elemental chains, because it's like, oh god, I drew 3 straight fire spells off these stupid Blasteroids, and now I don't have any good elementals to play. So there's this like kind of game plan and deck construction question that comes into mind when I look at these cards that does make me nervous. I will say though too that like these fire spells seem pretty great. Like, you know, deal 4 for 2. Okay, I love that, right? Solar Flare. This is very often going to be a really cheap like consecration, you know. I love that, especially that this scales so well with spell damage. Like, give this +2 spell damage, it costs 3, you're like over the moon, right? I'm dealing 4 to everything, even for 3 costs. I'm happy. I'm wiping a board, I'm getting some face damage. So like a lot of these cards individually do look pretty pushed. Like Blastoid, the discount here is insane on these, right? Like drawing these is going to make all of those cards really good. Even potentially the big stuff could be really good. So in a weird way, I almost like a lot of this elemental stuff better without the need to like rely on Seron in the late game. Now you probably still run this because it's just like, it's sort of free. It's 1 slot in your deck. It gives you these late game outs. But I do think kind of solving the deck construction around this and finding an optimized list might not be as simple as you think at first glance. I don't know if it's just like toss all of them into a deck. So I love Seron. I think this probably gets there just because it's pushing so much stuff at it. Like it's pushing a lot of numbers, a lot of discounts, a lot of fire spell damage. There's probably just enough there to make this cohesive and make it good. But I do have legitimate concerns that this falls off because a 6 mana setup play like this is a pretty big commitment that still often takes a little while to pay off. That might not be fast enough for a deck that demands sometimes speed with the elemental package. It's not like, you know, a slow sort of package if you're committing to this. And I think you have to commit to elementals to make stuff like Overflow Surger work. So I don't know if you can just toss in a Seron fire elemental package into another deck. Like I think it's all in on elementals for it. So just some hesitations here, but ultimately, you know, Blastoid looks really strong individually. Blazing Accretion honestly looks really strong individually. Like you're very happy, of course, to draw a bunch of cards for 3 on a body. That's great. Like I said, this looks good individually. Supernova actually looks pretty slow individually. I'll spend a little more time on this card independently, but Spontaneous Combustion also, of course, just looks pretty good. Like sometimes playing this on 2 is not a disaster other than breaking your elemental chain. But the ability to go 2 for 4 to face is really nice, especially with spell damage. So moving on over to Supernova in a little more detail. 8 mana fire spell here. Fill your hand with random fire spells. They cost 1, which, you know, in a vacuum, like, yes, of course, if you've got 8 mana to spend and some time on your hands and some life on your hands, obviously that's going to be amazing. There are a lot of fantastic fire spells for 1. You get Sunset Volleys. You get Firelands Portals, you get Fireballs. The opponent's probably just dead if this hits, you know, 6-7 things in hand. That's just like a crazy amount of stuff. So how do you get to that point, right? Like, is this in an elemental deck where you just empty your hand and you play a Supernova as a last kind of Hail Mary? I don't think that really makes sense. It doesn't really line up there. I don't think this goes in big spell Mage either, by the way. You'd rather just play a Tsunami and win now than kind of win later off the Supernova. In essence, this 8 mana delay in order to get this crazy payoff might be too slow. In a lot of ways, this kind of reminds me of Millhouse Mana Storm for big spell mages, where you're playing this one big slow thing in order for the pop-off turns later. But with Millhouse, you know, at least you're getting your body, and notably, you know, you're kind of choosing the cards that are discounted in hand, and you can reliably do things. This could give you a lot of weird little stuff that maybe doesn't go that far with the discounts. It's like, oh, great, I got 4 explosive runes. What am I going to do with those? You know what I mean? So it's just inconsistent, expensive. The payoff is there, but you got to have hand size for that payoff to be realized. I think there's just a lot of awkwardness around this card, and it doesn't really make sense to me in Fire Spell Mage. Doesn't really make, or Fire Elemental Mage doesn't make sense to me in Big Spell Mage. So what I think this card is, importantly, is one of those that exists in pools. It's randomly generated. You know, sometimes you'll play it out of desperation. Sometimes it'll come off of a Yogg style effect or whatever, and it's going to have an impact on the game. I don't think this is a card that's run much in actual deck lists, but still an important one to exist. Still one we're going to talk about a lot, probably. Still a significant card, just not a good one in deck lists specifically. So then our final card here is Pocket Dimension, 4 mana arcane spell. Discover a spell, repeat until you see one for the 2nd time. So you're always going to get 2 discovers off this guaranteed, because you got the 3 unique cards the first time. Second time around, you get 3 new ones. If one of those showed up in the first batch, you're done. If those are 3 unique new cards again, you roll again. So, you know, the second check is checking on 3 cards. The third check is checking on 6 cards. The fourth check is checking on 9 cards. So, you know, your pool of repeats kind of grows over time. So, you know, you're going to hit the eventual you know, limit here on what this card can do. Now in wild format, this might actually just discover like who knows how many things, a million. You can easily, I bet, get a full hand of cards in wild because there's so many spells. Standard has a much smaller pool of stuff, so you know, hitting a repeat is going to happen more often. That said, I didn't check the math on this. I'm sure some people have already done it. I have to imagine you know, 3 spells on average at least out of this. I think there will definitely be instances where we only hit 2, but maybe 3 or 4 is probably a pretty common breakpoint for Pocket Dimension. That said, I don't really think it's worth it, man. They're not discounted in any way. It's just a big old pile of value that you got to spend 4 mana on. I think that's going to be too slow. Most decks just won't be willing to do that. There's so many other ways to generate spells, draw spells, find spells, discount spells. I just don't really know how this competes in that world. And if you need like a big old pile of value, you know, play Supernova. We just saw that. You know, you need 8 cards in hand. Play that one. A little more expensive, but you know, you got time anyway. You're spending all this mana. So for me, I just don't really see this getting there. Like there is kind of this argument. It's like, well, you know, I'm just desperate for one specific thing, and this gives me more chances to potentially dig kind of for that one specific thing. But not always. Sometimes you'll only get 2 discovers out of this, and that's not that great of an odds to find it either. So I guess for me, this just looks pretty expensive for an effect that doesn't really have that big of a payoff other than just value for value's sake. So all that said, let's go ahead and score these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Exarch Hataru is a 3-star card. Seron is a 4-star card, but just barely and really propped up by the rest of his package. Blasteroid is a 4-star card. Blazing Accretion is a 4-star card. Solar Flare is a 4-star card. Supernova is a 2-star card. Spontaneous Combustion is a 4-star card. Pocket Dimension is a 2-star card. And there you go. That's the Mage set for Great Dark Beyond. The Draenei stuff, man, it didn't go very deep, did it? With only a few cards here, but the fire elemental stuff, this just like, I love the artwork on this. Like, I just want to play this because these cards look cool. Seron just looks so sick, dude. Really excited to try that. So all in all, share your thoughts on these cards down below. Thanks much as always for watching. Stay tuned for, I think we got warrior cards tomorrow, and until then, game on.